Let's go ahead and get started.
All right, let's do it. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. I don't know about y'all, but it's kind of surreal for me to be able to talk about anything besides what's going on in DC and COVID-19. So it's really thank you, thank you, NCOG City Planning, for giving us a reason to talk about something else. There are other important things in this world, and it's really a delight anytime I get to see neighbors face to face, even if it is just via Zoom. Um, so, so tonight we are talking about missing middle housing, and I know that most of us that are in here know what this is. But Travis, am I right that other people can view this as a recording later? Is that correct? Good deal, sir. All righty. Well, then I will go ahead and let you all know a little bit about why this matters to me, why I sponsored the initiation of the research and development of this project by NCOG City Planning, and why it just matters to me in general. For those of you that don't know, the missing middle housing, and they'll go into this more in the presentation, is all of those things between those big single family residences and the giant apartment complexes. There's a lot of other options for housing, and in my years as a city councilor, I have seen more and more folks, from kids right out of college or going into college, seniors retiring, even empty nesters who just want to downsize into something smaller, or new families starting out that need an option that's a little different than what we have in some of our neighborhoods. And we've got some space. It's not always the kind of space available that would accommodate a traditional single family home. And so we're looking at some of the other options here. One of my biggest priorities is to make sure that our neighborhoods are safe. And we know the density can really help promote safety, more eyes on the street, more neighbors looking out for you. We also really want those thriving, healthy neighborhoods where there's a lot going on that supports our local businesses. And honestly, another big thing that I know matters a lot to all of us in District 4 is that we're utilizing the space that's already under development and not going out there and continuing to sprawl Tulsa out further and further, both building more infrastructure that we have to pay for and tearing down more forests that maybe should just stay there. There's a lot of reasons that missing middle makes sense. And so I'm really grateful to everyone who's watching tonight, or who will take the time to look at this later and give us feedback. This is a plan that we are reviewing, that we are considering. It is not set in stone tonight. We really do want feedback and interaction with the neighbors. And I, again, cannot thank Susan Miller and her team enough for all of the thoughtful research that you all are putting into this. I've been having a lot of fun learning about it. And with that, I will let you take it away. Thanks again, and I'll be here for questions and learning more myself.
Thanks, Counselor. Let's see. First, I'm going to introduce our team that's on the call tonight, and I'll talk a little about our agenda for this evening and what we will be talking about. So, I'm Susan Miller, the director of the Tulsa Planning Office. Travis Hulse is the principal planner for the planning and design section of our office. And he'll be talking a lot about the housing study, which he was really deeply involved in. Nathan Foster is senior planner in current planning, which, he's been around for almost as long as I have at the planning office. So he knows, he's our zoning expert. So he'll talk about what a zoning overlay might look like. Amy, she's a planner in the planning design group, also was in current planning for a while. So she's also familiar with zoning and what it does and how it works. And Emily Scott, who's on the call. She is our neighborhood revitalization planner. So she's heading up a really exciting new program we have in our office, working with a select neighborhood. So that's who's on the call tonight that you'll be seeing. A little bit about what we're going to be talking about. First, we will have, and Travis will give this, a summary of housing study and the results of community surveys. We had a survey, last fall, I think, housing and community survey. We had a lot of respondents there, and so it's going to go over some of those results. And also just talk about other adopted city policy about housing and how the missing middle, the overlay, and sort of making those that a more feasible option. It really implements a lot of those documents and a lot of those adopted plans and policies. Then we're just going to talk in general about missing middle housing, what it is, the forms it takes, and get you more familiar with that. And then really what it means to have an overlay that can help facilitate that more in certain neighborhoods, in the near downtown neighborhoods. So, so we'll go into that in as much of a detail as you want. I think we're not going to dive too deep in the presentation, but we're happy to if you want to, if you know those details and want to have that conversation with me and Nathan. So also we'll just talk about next steps, what this means. Overlays are a little complicated. There's some process there. So we'll talk about what those next steps are. Then we'll have an open question and answer session. I do need to talk a little about some of the kind of how we'll need to work it tonight. We had a presentation last Thursday night and we were hacked. So we learned a lot from that meeting, and that was a very weird situation. So once the presentation starts, they will not allow people to unmute themselves. I think that's right, just to keep that hacking from coming into this presentation. So everyone will be sort of on that mode until the presentation is over and the question and answer session starts, and then we'll lift that restriction or whatever you call it off. But in the meantime, as we're going through the presentation, if you have comments or questions, if you could please put those in the chat function. And then as we did with our meeting last week, we will go in and we'll start pulling those questions and just answering them, as we get to that point. So that's really helpful. So you don't forget, so we can get to them as soon as we can. Chat is always a really good thing to do. I did want to say we have about 35 slides in this presentation. So probably about a 30-minute or so presentation. And of course, we have this meeting scheduled for 2 hours. So as long as you want to, have the discussion about the overlay and the missing middle or whatever those components are of this presentation you want to talk about, we don't have to be here for 2 hours for sure. But I just want to let you know we will have quite a bit of time for discussion after our presentation is over. And I think that's kind of all I wanted to set up, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Travis.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, and I saw, looks like we've got a couple things falling in the chat. I appreciate that. So please, as we won't be able to really stop and cover things, just start dropping those things in there in the chat, any thoughts, comments, observations, and we'll make sure to follow up at the end. So before we kind of get started into presenting a few of these concepts and the housing study and overlay and some of the words Susan mentioned, wanted to just quickly kind of ask this question. This is important to this conversation. Tonight is specific to the Riverview Cherry Street kind of neighborhood area, I'll say. And there's been a lot of planning processes in the past, really going back 10 years, comprehensive plan when it was done in 2010. So we wanted to just quickly poll this group for all of you that are here tonight and ask the question of, which of all of these have you participated in? So Amy's going to launch a poll here. Should be pretty easy to follow along with. If you just click the ones that you've participated in, that'll give us a sense of what you've done thus far.
Travis, hopefully this is one of the only technical difficulties. It says I'm logged in from another device and the polling session is inactive. So it won't pull up. Maybe we could share it later on, but I will try to figure that out. Okay,
yeah, we would just need, I guess whoever's logged into the account in addition to you would just need to log out. So we'll give that a second to see if that goes away. So yeah, let me just, I guess I'll hit pause on that for a moment here because we are interested to know kind of what people have participated in. It'll be helpful for us as we have this conversation, but we can go ahead and go to the next slide, Amy, while you try to figure that out a little bit. So one of the things that's really setting this conversation up is the housing study. Many of you may recall a housing study recently completed early of 2020. It really started back in 2019 and went on for a good 6-8 months or so, really going through a market analysis. There was a lot of engagement done through that process. And it was an update to a study done previously in 2010. And this graphic, you can kind of get a sense of what in 2010 was really kind of the focus, really more towards downtown in that area within the IDL. So this housing study that was done about 10 years later really broadened that boundary and our scope of understanding. I think the city as a whole and our leadership has recognized the power and the opportunity that exists within these neighborhoods surrounding downtown. And so that boundary was expanded to really understand from a market perspective what opportunity there was for housing and specifically a 10-year demand. So it was really finance market-based analysis, but that was done by a consultant out of St. Louis, Development Strategies. But it also really reached out in a different way than the previous study to talk with people, to interact with people living in these neighborhoods, much like we are tonight. And this is kind of a follow-up to that. But some of the questions that came out of that study that we were really trying to address is things like, how can we address the market gap at all income levels, looking at affordability, looking at workforce housing, and even on up to luxury units. Wanting to know what support there is across the board. From the development community, it was important to understand if there were challenges from the market in bringing some of these things to bear. You hear the terms, will it pencil, all that type of kind of question. And, so we spent a lot of interacting with folks in the development, finance, and lending institutions, wanting to know if there were issues and challenges that we might face. And probably more important than that, talking to the people who live in these neighborhoods. What are the benefits? What are the concerns? All of those things. And we're going to get into that specifically with this conversation tonight in talking about that. And overall, I think a part of doing a study is to identify those barriers that exist. So as we went through this process, that was a lot of what came out of our work, is understanding those barriers. And we'll talk a little bit in more specifics here in a moment about one of those things specifically. So over the next 10 years, this is kind of the conclusion of what the study produced. And there's a lot of information here. I think what I would point to is a couple of things. One, this is giving you a sense of over the next 10 years, what the unit demand looks like. So in total, it was around 3,000 units or so. And we broke that down by income level. And why that's important is because it tells us, like Councilor McKee started with, there's a diversity of need within these neighborhoods. It's not just one group that's struggling to find housing options. It's across the board. And in fact, it's a little bit more, little bit more so within those affordable, workforce, and moderate income levels. So looking at the slide, you can kind of see how those income levels break down. I'm not going to get into this too much now. If you have questions about it later, certainly can. Otherwise, there's a full study that really explains all of that that's available online, and we can provide that to you for you to kind of digest a little bit more. One of the other things that housing study really looked at was asking questions about what types of housing options might we consider within that boundary that I showed you a little bit earlier. So this may look familiar to some of you. We did launch a survey as a part of that effort, asking a question about, which of these housing types would you be interested in, or would you be, would you prefer to see developed and built? Some of these housing types that you're looking at aren't necessarily options in the zoning code specifically. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but this gives you kind of a visual flavor or a visual sense for what different options there could be. And so we asked people about that. We wanted to know what people are interested in. We got a lot of responses, not only within the study area, but also citywide. We even had some responses outside of the city of Tulsa. So over 1,700 people responded to that survey. And this is just one question that we asked. There was a number of other questions. But this question was, if such a building were well located within downtown or the surrounding neighborhoods, would you be interested in this type of building? And we listed all those options. We threw those images on the survey. And this is how that shook out. For all 1,700 people, this is what we heard. So for the people that responded, you can see that, above half of people who said yes, they would be interested in this type of building, said anywhere from apartments to detached homes, to a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, to townhomes. There was some things that maybe weren't so interesting to the broader audience, micro units, high-rise apartments. So we started to kind of understand that there was a threshold. Apartments can mean a lot of things. The zoning code kind of defines what that means. And really it can be anything from 4 units on up to 200 units, 300 units. And I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but I don't know if there's a cap necessarily for unit count. But it was important to kind of understand that there's a interest in a diversity of different housing options. So more important to our conversation tonight, what we're going to kind of break down here over the next few slides is to show you what those responses look like based upon the geography of these neighborhoods that we're engaging with. So you're the first group that we're talking to. We have 5 different neighborhood areas that we're going to be in the next couple of weeks. And we're going to have a similar conversation because we really want to get down to the nuts and bolts a little bit with you, the people that live in these neighborhoods, that are invested in these neighborhoods, and have a conversation about what we heard from you or the people that participated. And if we didn't hear from you specifically on this call, on this Zoom session, we'll have an opportunity to do that here at the end to kind of get your perspective and hear what you think. So, for example, for people living within the shaded area there, we were able to break down the survey responses to look at what did they say, how did they respond. And there's some similarities, to the broader response that we received region-wide, primarily citywide. For the most part, a lot of people really have little interest in micro units, little interest in some of your higher rise apartments. But this group, over 50% said that they'd be interested in a walk-up apartment or even a high rise, on up through most every option. And it's interesting because as we go through this, you'll see that those vary a little bit. And that's important to this conversation. So this zip code, or this kind of highlighted area, which really isn't so much the Riverview Cherry Street neighborhood we're talking to tonight, but thought it would be important to show you. They were especially, uninterested in those micro units, high-rise apartments, modern walk-up apartments. So those kind of fell towards the bottom of their list in terms of preference and things that they would be interested in the type of building. The last zip code that we'll show you kind of to the west of you, a few, I think maybe even a couple more get added to that list, falling more within that apartment type housing option. And so we take this and we kind of say to ourselves, okay, we've asked a question, we've seen the market demand, we understand what we've heard from the consultants as far as what the market can support. This is what we're hearing from the neighborhoods. How do we understand how to make this work? How can we bring this to fruition and make this a reality? So one of the priority actions in the housing study was to identify existing barriers to what is known as missing middle infill development. And it's a lot of words. I'll explain it here in a second. But looking at the regulations, that's something that the planning office can really look at. We administer the zoning code. It's within our purview in our office. So we were charged with looking at the regulations specifically within the zoning code, understanding if there were barriers that would prevent these different housing options from being built, and considering what would be a overlay to potentially allow different housing options. So that's really what we want to talk about tonight, and get your feedback. And we're going to present you with what our proposed solution would be, as we did identify some of these barriers. And Nathan will get into that a little bit more here in a second. I do just want to briefly reiterate what Councilor McKee mentioned. Missing middle housing, I think this graphic probably says it better than I can. That's really what we're talking about. You'll see some different terminology: multiplex, bungalow, court, things you won't necessarily see in the zoning code or in this presentation, but we definitely have similar options to those. They're just called something different. But missing middle is this idea that it's missing because it typically hasn't been built since the mid-40s. I think Riverview, Cherry Street, we do have some great examples of this. And I think your neighborhood has some amazing diversity as far as housing goes. Middle because size-wise and otherwise, it's kind of in between the detached home and the large multifamily complex. So I want to just go to quickly some of the things that we've heard in the past in our conversations about these types of housing options and diversity that we've asked about, had conversations about in previous planning experiences. So on the next slide, we'll see one of the recent surveys that we conducted really asked about the benefits to this potential infill of housing. And infill is simply just saying adding new housing to an existing neighborhood. Kind of the most general simplified way of saying what infill is and what we mean by that. So this is a different survey. This survey was conducted, as Susan mentioned, in the fall through July through October, I think, and had a lot of responses on here as well. This is citywide, so what we kind of heard citywide. And people, what they told us is pretty similar to what we've heard over the years. So kind of the top three that we saw on the next slide talks about replacement and rehabilitation of older or poorly maintained homes, more efficient use of existing city infrastructure, and preservation of those farmland and green space areas outside of the city, kind of suggesting that if we focus development within the urban kind of core of the city, then we will likely preserve what is, kind of available or outside on the fringes. We'll maximize our use and efficiency of existing infrastructure. And hey, knowing that many of these neighborhoods are potentially older, have been around for a long time, there's likely some need for rehabilitation of either poorly maintained homes or even lots that are now vacant. A lot of different things. So this is a reoccurring theme that we've heard over the years. And we've heard that in relationship to small area plans. Amy, I don't know if we've figured out if we have the ability to pull up or not. No, okay. So I'll just briefly highlight a couple of those plans that we asked about, but earlier. So the downtown area master plan, be curious to know how many people were in this room or participated in that, but it covered kind of this pink area that you see on the map here on the right. This was something that was identified even back then, creating more housing for a wider sector of people. We even talked about transit-oriented development. That's definitely a new thing as we have bus rapid transit system running along Peoria and soon to be along Route 66. So these are relevant to those same ideas and shared back then even. We also saw in the Utica Midtown Corridor Small Area Plan, similar recommendations from the neighborhood. And in this particular case, this is kind of a little bit out of Riverview and Cherry Street, but again, it's more just to kind of reinforce we've been hearing this a fair amount, enhancing existing housing diversity, providing a range of housing choices. And then the last one is just the comprehensive plan. So citywide, this is something that we have heard and continue to hear. So I won't belabor the point anymore. I think you understand where we're coming from, feeling like this is something we've heard for a while now. Councilor McKee has introduced this possibility of developing an overlay, which would be a tool to really lead us into that way of allowing for these different housing types. And so I'm going to let Nathan spend a little bit of time talking about what an overlay is, what do we mean by that, and all of the details that includes.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Travis. So as Travis mentioned earlier in his presentation, one of the first things coming out of the housing study was a recommendation that we go ahead and audit existing regulations to understand where the barriers were to some of those uses or some of those building types that we've discussed being in demand and also desired by people within some of these neighborhoods. So back in 2018, the city did an overhaul of their entire zoning ordinance, and as a part of that, adopted a new tool that really could be used to tailor zoning in certain geographies when we have a specific purpose or intent, whether it be a planning recommendation or some sort of neighborhood desire to apply additional zoning rules or to loosen certain zoning rules, that we could use this as somewhat of a hat to apply to that base zoning, whatever it was, and create some specific rules for this area or this geography. That really helps us when it comes to our current zoning. The way our current zoning districts work is really kind of a one size fits all, where we have single family neighborhoods zoned residential single family. Some of these more downtown neighborhoods do have a mixture of some multifamily residential districts as well. But when we use an overlay, we can tweak those underlying zoning districts all together and in a more holistic way than trying to rezone individual properties or go in and figure out which ones don't work and which ones do. This instead would allow us to kind of fix some of that stuff on one whole basis. And so that overlay essentially becomes an adopted part of our zoning code. There would be a text amendment that applies that text to our zoning and makes it part of the overlay chapter of the zoning code. And then the next step after that would be actual map amendments to go in and apply whatever those standards are that we adopted to those specific areas. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those steps when we get to the end of this, but that kind of just sets up what the overlay is as a tool. So initially, the barriers that we have addressed in these areas, in the downtown area, that was identified by the housing study, really pertained primarily to use. But when you start digging into the criteria that our current zoning allows for these types of uses, we also discovered certain barriers with the existing lot patterns. And so, as you can expect, as zoning changed over the years, a lot of times multifamily type developments and density for residential was always anticipated to land on larger lots, and it needed wider lots and more frontage on streets to accommodate some of that stuff. And what we're seeing is really an attempt to try and reverse some of that and to go back to a development pattern that you really already see in a lot of these neighborhoods. And I think someone even mentioned in the chat earlier, if I noticed correctly, that a lot of these neighborhoods already have a diversity of housing. And that highlights another issue in that some of these exist purely in a grandfathered fashion. They were there before the zoning code changed. And so if something were to happen to those structures, if there was any sort of demolition, or if someone had a fire and it was destroyed beyond a certain percentage, they couldn't reestablish that use where it was today. It would be restricted back to whatever that underlying zoning is. And so in a lot of these areas, that's really just a single family home is all that could be built. So you're looking at a scenario where you might lose 6 units that were renting for a more affordable price to only one single family home being rebuilt in its place. And that really has taken a toll on some of the housing availability in these neighborhoods. So what we wanted to do is identify those specific issues with the lots as well as the use so that we could make those lots accommodate the same thing that we're talking about, trying to encourage people to develop in some of these neighborhoods if it were appropriate. That includes non-conforming lots as well. So in addition to the non-conforming uses I mentioned, non-conforming is really that grandfathering. It's something that came in legally because the regulations changed after it was established. And just like the apartment uses, that can be applied to lots as well. So if the lot isn't big enough anymore, it can't accommodate new development, that would lead people to have to go through a pretty strenuous process to obtain variances and things to develop those lots that we would like to avoid if they're trying to do something that we're actually encouraging people to do in these neighborhoods. And then the last thing is parking. So continuously, when any new development is proposed, there's a requirement to provide a certain level of parking for the use that could support what they're doing. And more often we're seeing, as people desire to get more close to the urban core and live in these higher density type uses, that the parking requirements exceed what's actually necessary to serve some of the units. And so one of the things we're looking at is trying to reduce the parking requirements for some of these uses to accommodate those types of buildings on these lots again, knowing that a lot of people maybe don't have cars or maybe won't need a car, given the proximity of this to some of the transit lines as well as to the downtown area. So with that, I want to kind of explain each of the uses as they're described in our zoning code. Travis mentioned all the housing typologies that showed up on that survey and that we got feedback on. So our first goal was really to go into our zoning and understand where those fit within the existing building types and the classifications in the code. So starting with townhomes, our code will allow townhouse development that's as few as 2 units, but could go up and exceed even more than that. But typically the way a townhouse is prescribed is that it's going to be attached units. These are single family units. So it's one residence on one lot, but each lot would share those common lot lines with a common wall that attaches those units. And that's a pretty typical townhouse development scope. It allows for smaller lot sizes so you can get more units on what would typically only serve maybe 1 or 2. And so this is an option that was presented in something that in our code currently is restricted in some of those single family areas. In addition to townhouses, duplexes, I think, are probably one of the most common things we see proposed in some of these neighborhoods. It's a very incremental step up from what would originally be approved on that lot, which would just be like a single family home in certain cases, and instead allows there to be 2 units on one lot within a single building. And so that can be seen in a lot of different ways. You can have your standard side-by-side duplex with 2 entrances, and you can have a duplex like is shown on the screen. That's a stacked duplex that has a single entry, but the units are either side-by-side within the building, or they have, an upstairs-downstairs configuration for the units that are in there. So essentially anything that can allow just 2 units on one lot is going to fall under that duplex classification. Currently, duplexes in single-family neighborhoods are only permitted by a special exception. So I think something you would see as a part of the overlay would be a proposal to potentially allow duplexes by right versus making them go through that additional step to get that extra permission. So a few examples that were drawn up in SketchUp by a staff member of ours, Daniel Jeffries, put a few examples together. These are actual houses that are in the Heights neighborhood with a duplex inserted, just to show that how a duplex could fit into an existing neighborhood character without really, straying from what's already there and what's in place. A lot of times duplexes look very much like the single family homes on either side of them. These are plugged in a lot of the neighborhoods around downtown already, like the Pearl District, like Swan Lake, like a few of those other historic neighborhoods. You can find these examples. So this is just another example as we kind of click through these of those duplexes kind of just inserted into an existing neighborhood. So the next housing type that we've uncovered in our zoning and we think is an appropriate mix for this particular issue is the idea of a cottage house development. So cottage houses can be as large or as small as they can as far as meeting building code requirements for dwelling units. But the difference here is that they're oriented into a common open space, like a courtyard, for example, versus being oriented out towards a street. And these typically would only exist on one lot. So this is a common ownership, common maintenance scenario, kind of like a condominium, but instead of having everybody in their own attached unit, they're actually in an individual home that's built around this courtyard scenario. And I think the zoning code requires the entries and things to come in from the rear of those exterior homes and allows for that to be a more shared space, kind of a village orientation, versus having something that's just your common subdivision along a public street. The reason I mentioned the size of the home is that this is one of those concepts people have looked at when discussing the idea of building smaller homes, or what some would call a tiny home. I use tiny home with discretion because tiny homes can be interpreted to be a lot of different things. The zoning code is pretty restrictive when it comes to any type of a mobile unit. And a lot of times tiny homes, when someone says that, they're talking about a mobile type structure that could be placed on the home site and then moved somewhere else later on. And when our zoning code anticipates anything like that, it would require additional relief. So anytime allowances are made for single unit detached homes, they can be tiny homes, but they just have to be constructed homes. They can't be any sort of mobile unit like is often brought up in those scenarios. So a multi-unit house, this is very similar to apartments, but it is limited in how many units can be included. It also has restrictions on how the design must look. And so you're looking at either 3 or 4 units in a single building, but the zoning code requires it to have a single entry point that's street oriented. So this is another one that's very present in some of the neighborhoods we're talking about, where you have 4 units inside a building and there's a single entry in the center of the building on the front. And in fact, there's even a couple of examples shown there that are found at 17th and Quincy here in Tulsa. So this has a look of a detached house really, but inside it's compartmentalized into more units and allows for that affordability to be considered as well. And then finally is really the apartment concept. Our zoning code doesn't currently have limitations beyond just what the lot size can accommodate when it comes to how many units can go into an apartment building. So the idea of approving apartments or permitting apartments in some of these neighborhoods often comes with a really quick note that we would likely look to restrict these to a certain level of units. Typically what we saw when we were looking at the housing study as well as the survey results was more of a smaller type apartment building, either 6 units on a lot, or if maybe there were 2 lots, it could go up to 12 units. And so when thinking about the overlay, that was really the idea we had in mind, was that we would build in some sort of restrictions to ensure that if that apartment unit was utilized in one of these neighborhoods, it wouldn't be utilized to build something that was totally out of scale and instead would look more similar to something like you see on the screen now. This is just a few other examples. A triplex from the zoning perspective would be like apartments. That's considered an apartment use if you look at the way those uses are defined. So this is just an example of how, you could put 3 units in what would typically be a footprint potentially for just a single unit home in one of these base zoning districts, and certainly accommodates that variety of housing that we're talking about. This is an existing building as well that's located at 16th and Quaker. It's kind of the south of Cherry Street, and just showing that you could, again, 6 units, very comparable to the individual homes on either side of it. So we had another poll built in, and I'm going to assume the same issue will be present for this particular poll. It does look like there's 22 participants total in here, with a few staff counted in that. So I think you can take this question, we can roll it into our discussion, and you guys can think about this and let us know in the chat kind of, are these types of things you would support? Do you support them with caveats? And the stuff that we're presenting today, if it were presented to you to be something in your neighborhood, what would be some of your concerns about these housing typologies that we're discussing? So I don't know, Travis, do you think that best?
Yeah, we're going to try one thing real quick, just
to
see if it'll work. Amy, can you give me the host controls real fast? All right, so for some reason it worked for me. So we'll go ahead and roll this way. So I'm going to launch this poll. If you wouldn't, we'll kind of give you 30 seconds to a minute, if longer, if you need it. pretty self-explanatory, kind of keeping in mind what we've talked about tonight. And if you have questions, then we can drop those in the chat or talk a little bit more about that. And keep in mind, this is, really just helping us as we continue to refine this overlay and understand at a neighborhood level the preferences of the community, will just help us to approach the overlay and moving forward, making sure that we're being responsive to the interests of the folks that are, again, invested in this community. And we'll be having a conversation with the other 4 neighborhoods that we plan to engage here in the next week or so. We've got about a third of people so far, and that includes staff that participated. We're asking staff to not participate. We don't need to skew the results. So we'll give it another 30 seconds, so maybe a minute here for you to respond, and then we'll share those results and kind of let everyone see what we've heard. And if you don't support any of those, that's totally fine. Dropping a comment in the chat if you'd like, you certainly can. If you prefer to not tie your name to it, then you just feel free to not respond. But I guess it would be helpful for us to know if, maybe talk a little bit more about that when we get into our Q&A here in a minute. Yeah, and just type none in the chat if that's your answer, would probably be preferred. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll here. So hopefully everybody can see that. Nathan, Amy, someone give me a thumbs up. You guys see that? Okay. It looks like, again, a broad diversity for those of you who said that any of these or some of these would be a housing option you would support. Pretty diverse options as far as we're understanding here. More support for things like a duplex or cottage house developments. Very good. And I didn't check to see. We'll certainly look in our chat here if there were any none or any other comments. We don't mean to exclude your ability to say how you feel in this poll. Kind of the easiest way to ask the question, but if you care to explain a little bit more, there's a nuance to why you answered the way you did. Let's talk about that either here, or if you want to reach out to us more one-on-one, if you're comfortable with that, we're certainly open to that as well. So I'm gonna stop sharing these results, and then we can move on. I don't think we'll go back to the first poll. This was really maybe the more important question to ask. So you back up, Nathan.
Yeah, I think we have just the Q&A slide set up for next.
Maybe the next steps.
Oh yeah, the next steps. So as I mentioned earlier, the process of actually adopting any sort of overlay or making an overlay effective for a neighborhood, it's a 2-step process. The first step is going through and actually adopting whatever the standards are or the regulations that are being proposed into the zoning code itself. At that point in time, it's pretty ineffective in that it's not applied to anywhere in the city yet, but that allows us the ability to then go out and make a proposal to apply those standards to a specific geography. And so that's where the map amendment would come in. So a process schedule for the text amendments is shown, or a tentative process schedule, I should say, and just to give you an idea of how that looks. So in starting any sort of process like this, obviously we have an initiation from council or from TMAPC to begin looking at something like this, and that's already occurred. So our next step is to take this back to a TMAPC work session, and that's the Tulsa Metropolitan Area Planning Commission. And a work session is really just an informal meeting with the Planning Commission to give them an opportunity to quiz staff, to ask their questions, to share any of the concerns they might have, and to just have that initial conversation with them before they actually have to start making decisions on anything like that. That's really just a meeting for the commissioners themselves to discuss. So it's not a public meeting. It's a really just discussion point. And so then Following a work session, it would move to a public hearing with the Planning Commission. At that step, drafts would be made available to the public and to anyone interested to review and to come to that public hearing and to make comments. They also would be able to share comments with our office, and I anticipate we would have obviously more opportunities for you to engage with our office before we got to the public hearing for those that had questions or concerns, before finally the council would actually adopt it and incorporate it into our zoning code. The map amendments would follow a very similar process, with the added step of there being obviously additional neighborhood engagement once those geographies were defined. So just in a hypothetical, if your neighborhood were to be proposed to be a part of an overlay, there would be multiple public meetings as an attempt to just make comments before there was any sort of actual hearing to make a decision. And then there would also be additional notices sent out to anyone who was included in that overlay by mail, as well as anyone within 300 feet of that overlay, to have more opportunity for people to participate in that process before ultimately kind of following that same step schedule that we took the text amendments through, which would be a work session with Planning Commission, followed by a public hearing, and then ultimately transmitting that over to the City Council for a final decision on whether or not it's to be adopted. Obviously, we have a lot more meetings that we're going to continue having this conversation with the other neighborhoods that were included in that housing study. We ask that you guys obviously stay in tune with us on as this process proceeds, and we're sharing a few links here for you all to stay engaged with our office, where you can see updates about the stuff that's ongoing. But yeah, we're going to continue to solicit feedback, and before we ever get to a point where we're actually making a proposal for those amendments, we want to make sure we've made considerations for all of the neighborhoods that we're looking at. So to wrap up, we really just wanted to provide a last opportunity for questions and answers. I know we have a few questions that we can get to that have already been placed in the chat, but we did just go ahead and throw some prompts here on the screen for you to consider as you kind of think about this. And we're also going to share our contact information with you all, so that if you had questions or you didn't want to participate tonight, you can always contact us and have those conversations offline. And we're always happy to share any more information that you want. So with that, I think if you guys want to help me, we can kind of just go through some of these chat messages. I saw a lot of discussion initially, just determining about the boundary, how we've just determined what neighborhoods we were looking at. And I think the most direct answer to that question is really based upon the housing study and what was initially done. This is the area where we've done the most research and we've started our diligence to make these decisions. We're certainly not ruling out that this could be applied in other neighborhoods or any areas of the city. We're just taking it step by step, and we're kind of trying to make sure we're going where we have the most information first, and making sure that we're obviously staying in tune with what the neighborhoods are interested in. You guys want to help me make sure we get everything?
Yeah. And Nathan, unfortunately, I logged out to figure out the polling thing. And so when I came back in, my chat is limited to what I've seen in the past like 10 minutes. But Kevin, I saw you raise your hand. You guys are welcome to join on, and we can hear your wonderful voices if you'd like as well. I don't know, Kevin, if you wanted to unmute yourself.
Travis,
this is Kevin.
Oh, go ahead, Kevin. I'll let you start. Go for it, sir.
Okay. So overall, generally supportive of this move. The question I have is, and Riverview is actually a great example of this because we have both pre-World War II missing middle housing and post-World War II missing middle housing, particularly along Frisco. And what defines good housing done this way, and the pre-war housing, is that the units face the street, they're frequently multi-level, the setbacks mirror the single-family homes around them, and they're built to a fairly high quality. In Riverview, Frisco Street being a great example, there's 4 or 5 complexes built in the 70s and 80s that are all single story. They face sideways, where the side of the property faces the street, and the doors all face the side of the lot line. And that really is the common typology you see, for instance, in townhomes built in all the fast-growing cities like Denver and Nashville, everywhere, where the buildings face sideways. But that's because they're cheaper to build, and you can sell them at a lower cost if you do that. And why this has been legalized historically, you don't get new development that replicates the charm of the pre-war development. So tight regulation of form is critical in my mind of how this presses forward. And I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit how you imagine design or form regulation that would accompany this change in use.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the overlay can work in two ways. It can help loosen restrictions like we've talked about when it comes to use, but it can also restrict things further, and it can apply additional regulation you might not find in other zoning districts. And so I think we don't have probably a direct answer to that at this time, but as we solicit this feedback and as we continue to look at these neighborhoods, we have the opportunity to incorporate, before directly applying something to a specific neighborhood, some of those context understandings and what we want to try to match within that neighborhood and how we regulate these new uses. And that really goes back to those lot and building regulations and how we set up setbacks, how we set up any height restrictions on these things, and building orientations. And really some of our mixed use chapter districts that we've used in other parts of the city have started to try and incorporate some of that more form-based zoning or zoning that looks more at the design of the building and regulates where it can sit and how it has to orient to the street. So there is some precedent for that in our code that I think we can look at, and we can try to understand, what helps make this appropriate for the neighborhood that we're proposing it in. And I think that's going to differ amongst all of these neighborhoods that we look at as a part of this review. So, but I agree. I think that is an important thing to consider.
I wonder, Nathan, how might this interact with the neighborhood character overlay option that we've initiated previously? Both to Kevin and to Demetrius's points about having these units fitting well into the neighborhood and having design elements within what is allowable. Would we utilize both these tools in concert? Is that the thought there, or yeah?
I think, it's kind of a merger of the ideas. I mean, we knew anytime we talk about the overlay, I mean, it's the same tool. So my thought on that, just in this initial discussion, is that we would try to accommodate that into the overlay we're assigning to that neighborhood. It wouldn't be a stacking of overlays to try and control what the form looks like in one hand and the use in another. I think we would try to tailor the overlay as one to that neighborhood as we go through that process. And obviously the neighborhood impact and engagement in that is going to be really crucial as we go through that process to understand what seems appropriate. But Susan, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, because I'm all of a sudden everything went a little crazy. Okay, yeah, absolutely, I agree with Nathan. I think, if we're saying that those types of housing are supported, if they are done in a certain way, that's where the form comes in. So yeah, to have those two separate overlays wouldn't make sense. It's really like they can utilize that, but this is how they need to be done, at least some general criteria there.
And I think that there has been, there are examples that we've looked at, I think, in other places on how that design can be, meaningfully controlled in a way that accommodates that same missing middle that we're trying to get at, while making sure that there's not a massive out of scale or out of character building being planted in the middle of an existing neighborhood. I do think that there's ability to help manage that within the overlay tool. So.
Nathan, I'm trying to kind of go in order. Is there anyone early on that you want to throw my way as far as questions go?
Well, I've got another one, Travis, if I may. Earlier, Aaron mentioned, our concerns, and I know I had mentioned this to you all in previous conversations about, as we build in density, we want to make sure we are not causing flooding issues. I know you all have been deeply involved with me in helping figure out what our alternatives to giant ponds and whatnot can be when we're trying to figure out how do we do the right infrastructure development, and certainly higher density can cause some runoff issues, and I know you all had some great answers to that when we talked about it before. Can you help us understand some more what we would be doing, what we would be thinking about as we're looking at this?
Yeah, there's there's definitely a lot to think about. I was just actually, while you're talking, pulling up the floodplain map for the city, just to kind of see. This is, I mean, of course, especially a concern within the Pearl District. Does look like there's a little bit of floodplain in the Riverview area, kind of running through near Veterans Park. And, you know, so a lot of it would have to do with how are we, or are we increasing impervious surface area? Many of the neighborhoods over time, when they are subdivided and, you know, planned and graded and, you know, infrastructure is laid out, supposed to be able to manage some of those issues as far as stormwater goes. So without having, you know, been super familiar with what that infrastructure looks like for this neighborhood, we kind of have to get into that. But, you know, just from a simple standpoint, that would really be the issue, is are we increasing impervious surface area? Some of these options that we presented tonight really wouldn't do that so much. Others maybe, but, you know, so like a multi-unit home, or a duplex, or something that's really at the scale of those detached houses, and you're not going to see much of a difference in terms of footprint. Now, that being said, I guess if you've had somewhere that is intentionally designed for stormwater management, that would be a whole nother issue. And so I think that's something that, you know, you typically, I don't know, just thinking about how we've maybe dealt with some of those in the past, that's always something that comes up during the building permit process. As far as an overlay, I don't know that those are issues that we tend to include within an overlay, but that's kind of my just off the cusp response to the potential concern you might see.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Travis, you touched on it, but, you know, we didn't consider altering some of the building envelopes on these lots beyond what may be seen as, you know, somebody might fill it already with a single family home that only holds one unit. Really, we're just allowing that space to be filled with more units than that single unit. And I think that's where a big consideration is made when it comes to stormwater management. But it's also just worth noting that those things would be looked at in a conjunction with any sort of new development being proposed, that there would need to be mitigation measures for their runoff and obviously ordinances in place to try and regulate some of that as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to this, and we talked about this before, that there are other tools within the city that we are looking at to be able to deal with some of those issues.
I see a question here about ADUs. We've talked about ADUs. In fact, Councilor McHugh, we just talked to you about it the other day. You brought it up kind of as part of our discussion. At the moment, we didn't include it because we were really focusing on what type of principal uses we were trying to allow in these neighborhoods. I will say we recently made some changes to the zoning code that removed at least the full out prohibition on accessory dwelling units, and at least allowed them to be included by special exception. So I think just a low-hanging fruit option for some of these overlay areas, if it were appropriate, would be to take that special exception requirement away and allow people to do ADUs by right within some of these neighborhoods. But yeah, that is something that's been discussed and is definitely a part of the conversation, to Daniel's question in the chat. I will let everybody know, like, I see some of you guys we're just getting feedback from you, and that's great. I may not respond to all of the comments, but I do want you to know we're going to keep all this feedback as we discuss kind of next steps for everything. Some of that being like the overall appropriate density for an apartment building. I saw Demetrius included 6 units would be a better maximum than 12 units. We're definitely still discussing what the appropriate number is on that. The 12 unit is just kind of a starting point and is really just based more in what was in the housing study. So I think a lot of neighborhoods, we may hear a discussion about what a more appropriate number might be.
And I think, and Demetrius, without getting into specifics, you know, the example you're talking about, I think that's a good good site for us to look at even. Because yeah, that had horrible parking and access solution, or it wasn't a solution, it was horrible proposal there. So that's why that didn't survive. But yeah, that's right. It'll be good for us to look at some of those really unique sites like that.
Yeah, it looks like Kevin dropped a few examples in the chat too, and that's another thing we're certainly open to. If you guys have examples, either good or bad, that you'd like to kind of look at as an example of what you think is appropriate, I mean, we're definitely wanting to consider everything. So
I think Daniel Jeffrey said it earlier, but you know, we aren't solid set on exactly where the boundaries of this are, but I think one of you all pointed it out earlier that the part of how we decided to look at these areas, these neighborhoods, is that they were part of the housing study, and so we have a lot of information about this that we're trying to really address some of the lack of housing around the downtown area, and also to the point that I mentioned in the chat, we also and maybe you all and NCOG can say more about this. We want to be able to have a group of citizens that will work with us, that is interested in this, that maybe, as you all are demonstrating here, Kevin and Demetrius and others, that you've seen things like this when they go well, when they don't go well, and can help us, you know, try some things and maybe have a proof of concept before we expand to some neighborhoods where this might feel really new. I know Aaron has pointed out that there are other neighborhoods that might need some more of this development. By trying this out in these areas that we're having this conversation in now, that does not mean that we're not going to do it elsewhere if it works. And again, it may not look the same in all areas. Am I saying that correctly, Susan?
Yeah, and also I'm sitting here thinking about, you know, so like the kind of the broad brush boundaries that were identified in the housing study, you know, between this conversation and further conversations when we get past just the text of it, you know, overlays are sort of a living, breathing thing, right? Until they're adopted, and then they still are a little bit, right? Because you can come and go and be zoned in and zoned out. So, I mean, there may be in the boundaries we're talking about tonight, there may be a few blocks that the neighbors just don't want that in their on their blocks, right? And so that's really going to be something we'll hear and we'll have to consider when the boundaries are really more you know, finalized there. So this is really to understand who would want this option for their neighborhood. And so I think Nathan said too, was really step one is to figure out what the text is, as far as, you know, how we can facilitate those different housing options. The second step is to determine where those could be applied. And so we will make a concerted effort then to notify every property owner and make sure every property owner is aware that this could be applied to their property. But it's a little complicated because we're trying to right now understand what should be in the text, and then later, you know, where that should be applied. But ideally everyone's involved in all of it, right? So that we can get the most participation in the overlay, and craft it in a way that most people are going to want to support for their neighborhood. So it's real important, I think, the whole process that people are involved in and tell us what they want to see.
Kevin asked a question about would it be allowed in RS zoning. Yeah, if the overlay were applied, anything that was afforded to properties in that overlay would apply underneath as well. So that if the uses were being permitted, the idea would be that it would be permitted in all of those underlying zonings, even though at the base those may prohibit it. This would be the opportunity to try and remove some of those restrictions. So regardless of the underlying zoning, the overlay can tweak those uses that are allowed.
And right now, as far as what we've been considering in the text, is not all of the RS zoning, right, Nathan? So right now it would be including RS3, RS4, RS5, and then RM1 and 2. Is that right?
Yeah, well, actually, maybe in all the RM
RMs, yeah, all
districts.
the RMs.
Yeah. So just really those top 3-tier single family neighborhoods, which is mostly what you see in these particular areas.
Mhm.
Demetrius asked if an overlay for a specific neighborhood could limit the types of missing middle housing that could be built. Theoretically, yes, a neighborhood could pursue an overlay to go the opposite direction if they chose. The way in which an overlay would move forward is just like any type of zoning. So it would either be a consent by all property owners. I think overlays require at least 10 contiguous property owners to be on board. But then it would either have to be initiated by those property owners and gone through the process, or vice versa. Similar to what we're doing here, it would have to be initiated by a council or planning commission initiation, which, given that it kind of lies against what we're talking about, would likely not be an initiation by the city.
I really think just leaving it alone in the zoning code and not having it part of this overlay is pretty limiting, right? And that's,
Yeah, if you're in already a primarily single family zone neighborhood, then you're already restricted from any of these housing types other than just detached homes or the potential duplex by special exception. But to Aaron's point, I think, it goes back to the same explanation of why we chose the boundary we did right now, but it also kind of leans into the idea that we're trying to get this housing close to the downtown area where we anticipate certain, resources to be, or certain options for people to live without cars or to have a more walkable lifestyle. That is part of a justification for looking more towards areas near downtown as it stands today. I think that the existence of some of this housing is only more supportive of the idea because of the fact that we're trying to allow those housing types that do exist to remain and to be rebuilt if something were to happen. And so just because there are already housing types like this in these neighborhoods is not a reason not to pursue something like this in that area. And so I think the reason we're focusing on this right now is because this is really a new concept, and the supporting materials we have and the research we've done has been done in this area. And that's why we're going to continue to look here. Obviously, same caveat as before, this is not limited to only these areas. It could also be used in other places later. I think we've primarily hit most of the questions coming in. Obviously, encouraging you guys to continue putting those in the chat if you have them. Obviously respond. I think we do. Is there another slide, Amy, just for everyone's benefit? If you want to write down our contact information, if you guys have further questions about this, happy to continue these conversations and obviously discuss any of this with you guys, as more questions come to mind or as if things come up for you.
Nathan,
Yeah,
at the top of
go
the
ahead.
meeting, at the top of the meeting, yeah, you all mentioned that this slide presentation and the video of this will be available. Where can people find that for their neighbors who weren't able to attend tonight?
Yeah, so we'll follow up. We will provide that in email. We'll follow up with an email sending that, as well as links to maybe a couple of things we've referenced, like the housing study. Not sure what else has come up, but we will also put the video probably on our Facebook. I think if Daniel's on here, you can correct me, but YouTube, we have a YouTube channel. We'll make it available there. So we'll have it a few different places and make sure that it is easy to access.
Good deal. I'll get that out through my channels as well once you all post it. Thank you.
And I know Zoom isn't really for everyone, quite honestly, probably not for me, except I'm here to present. So if you don't feel comfortable really sharing some thoughts, feelings, really, we really do encourage you to reach out to us. This is what we're here for. We'd love to have a conversation with you about any of these topics or issues. If you agree or if you disagree, we would love to hear your perspective. So any one of us listed on this page, I know Nathan and I have done a fair amount of the talking tonight, but any one of us would be happy to have a conversation with you. So please don't be shy and reach out to us, whatever is easiest or preferred.
Demetrius, the YouTube channel is just Tulsa Planning Office. There's some real riveting material on there if anyone would like to just review some of our old videos.
Hey, why is everyone laughing?
You got plenty of nerds in here, Susan. We'll don't worry, you're not alone.
It's good stuff, man.
I agree.
I would encourage you all to subscribe. So far, it seems we've only encouraged 2 people to do so.
Well, and what are you all calling this month? Planuary?
Planuary.
You're gonna have a lot more video content on there pretty quick, aren't you?
Yeah, we're really populating this.
Oh, good deal.
There's
Yeah.
30 meetings in Planuary.
Wow. That's wild.
It's
Hang in.
Planuary is January and February. It's the
Okay.
month, so.
Okay. That makes me feel better. I was a little worried about y'all.
And click on that link that Daniel just shared to our Facebook. That'll give you all the dates and details of those upcoming conversations. Some of them are much more broad and citywide than what we got into tonight, which is really kind of specific to this geography, about the comprehensive plan. And if you have a particular interest in any conversation, whether it's land use or economic development or transportation or housing in neighborhoods or lots of different things, another opportunity. So yeah, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that, or probably get yelled at by our colleagues for not mentioning it, I should say. All right, well, don't think I'm seeing anything else in terms of comments. So I just reiterate that we're moving forward to have these conversations over the next couple of weeks. We want to take all of this input and just move into refining some of the details in the overlay, the text especially first, and then working towards actually applying or understanding what that boundary might look like. And so I think Nathan mentioned this, but we will continue to communicate with you all, communicate through Counselor McKee, as well as some of the other channels we've been attempting to broadcast far and wide, just those details so you can participate and know what opportunities you have to participate as we move forward. So thanks for being here, everyone. We appreciate you.
Thanks, y'all. Stay safe. Get out in the sunshine on Wednesday and Thursday. It's going to be nice.
Hey, thanks, everybody.